Today, we've got our hands on what is increasingly becoming a bit of a rare bird. This is a 2001 Infiniti I30 with just 117,000 miles. And while it's one of the less exciting cars ever to come out of Infiniti, the I-Series is interesting because it represents a historical anomaly. This Nissan Maxima-based model, whose 9-year run took place roughly in the middle of Infiniti's now 30-year history, was the only attempt they ever made to counter the highly successful Toyota Camry-based Lexus ES. Compounding this car's obscurity level is the fact that it's a 2001 model, representing the middle ground in the split-level approach that Infiniti took in transitioning from the first to second generation I-Series. You see, the first generation I-30, based on the fourth generation Maxima, ran from 1996 to 1999. The second generation I-Series was fitted with a larger 3.5-liter version of the V6 for most of its 5 model year tenure, going by the name I-35 to reflect this, but for 2000 and 2001, there was a period where you had the new car with the old 3-liter engine. This is that car, and it wouldn't be so noteworthy if not for the fact that the 2002 I-35 came not just with a new name and new engine, but also with refreshed front and rear end styling, tweaks to the suspension, bigger brakes, and completely reconfigured options packages. So this 2000-2001 car was really kind of its own deal. Since Infiniti's first midsize sedan, the J30, and its latest midsize sedans, the M-Series and now Q70, have been purpose-built rear-wheel drive models that bore no relation to lesser Nissans, you might ask, what exactly was the impetus behind the release of the I-Series? Well, there were probably a couple of things. Number one, Lexus was doing it, and Lexus was the Japanese luxury brand to beat. Ever since day one in 1989, Lexus has always sold a mid-size so-called entry luxury sedan based on the mainstream Toyota Camry. And in spite of the Lexus ES's mainstream underpinnings, it's always been a good package that's masterfully differentiated from the Camry. It's also a fantastic business model with both high sales figures and healthy profit margins for Toyota. Reason number two for the birth of the I-30 was that it was cheap, and Infiniti parent company Nissan had fallen on hard times. From roughly 1993 to 1999, Nissan faced serious financial turmoil, and their product line underwent serious cost-cutting, out of which was born that first generation I-30, which was embarrassingly similar to the Maxima upon which it was based. Now, as an aside, to say that this car is based on the Nissan Maxima is a little bit of an oversimplification because, in fact, both cars are derived from an overseas model called the Nissan Safiro, which is actually more similar to the I-30 than it is to the US market Maxima, which is itself more accurately described as a cheapened version of the Safiro. While much more was done to separate this second generation I-30 from its Maxima counterpart, in fact, they didn't even share any sheet metal, this car still bears a family resemblance to its downmarket brother, strong enough for even casual observers to notice, prompting the question, why bother paying thousands of dollars extra for this one? After all, this car started at just a hair under $30,000 in 2001. And not only was the I-Series squeezed from below by the Maxima, it was flanked in the marketplace by the more comfortable Lexus ES and sportier Acura TL. Both cars were very well disguised from the Toyotas and Hondas they were based on, and ultimately, most buyers found themselves attracted to either the Lexus's supreme isolation or the Acura's driving engagement, leaving the jack-of-all-trades I-30 as a forgotten middle child, and even in the I-Series' best year, 2000, it was still outsold by each of them. Indeed, as handsome as this car is, there's no denying that it looks more than a little bit like a Maxima, particularly from the side. In fact, I think the I-30 even looks a little like a completely unrelated first-generation Altima from some angles, bearing an inter-platform corporate resemblance not unlike that among General Motors products of the 80s. The lines of the I-30 are soft, but with this car, designers seem to have had outgrown the extreme round craze of the mid-90s, and so the car's body still looks toned and muscular. Windshields both front and rear are steeply raked, however, the belt line is low and flat, the side windows are properly large, and the roofline is high and flat over the passenger space. The I-30 looks more premium than the Maxima with a tasteful dose of chrome, and styling is formal enough to look nice without being overwrought or stuffy. I personally find the rear end treatment and wheels of this generation i30 to be much better looking than those on the previous generation. Up front, the rather traditional waterfall grille is very similar to the older models, and a more modern looking grille with horizontal slats was part of the i35 revision. The paint on this one is a nice shade of dark blue that I think works well with the tan interior. The overall design language is unequivocally upscale, yet understated, and the i30 looks well dressed but still approachable. This may be a little generous, but I think that the i30 even looks faintly like an old Jaguar sedan from the right angle. The i30 may not look like a particularly big car, but step inside and you might be surprised. This car is 3 inches longer than the Maxima, itself a relatively large midsize car to begin with, and the front-wheel drive layout offers lots of interior volume. Passengers in the i30 are treated to loads of legroom, both front and rear, and good headroom as well. This isn't, however, a particularly wide car, so 3 abreast in the rear seat would probably be tight, and the center console has enough elbow space for both driver and passenger only if they really like each other. In keeping with the car's exterior, the cabin wears tasteful, restrained styling that's aged nicely. The two-tone tan color scheme I found particularly to my liking. Black and gray were offered as well, but I think this warmer interior would be the pick of the litter. The wood trim isn't real, but it looks good for imitation, and I like the color. It also isn't over-applied. The dashboard and door panels are constructed of predominantly soft-touch materials. Some of the only hard plastic in here is the bezel around the stereo and climate controls, which both looks good and feels solid. Plush carpeting, felt-lined door pillars, and a few dashes of chrome round out the cockpit's sufficiently diverse selection of materials. By the way, the door sill plates are stainless steel, a forward-thinking touch that still looks up to date. An expensive-looking electrofluorescent gauge cluster rises out of the well-designed dashboard, which is pleasingly low-slung for a front-wheel drive car. At the center, you'll find an analog clock, which has become an Infiniti trademark. Seating arrangements in the i30 are top-notch. The 8-way power driver's seat with lumbar support comes standard with memory settings and automatically slides back and forth to ease entry and exit. Like the steering wheel and gear shift, the seats are wrapped in good quality leather. The front seats are perfectly shaped for average-sized adults, and the padding is both comfortable and supportive. Armrests are well placed both left and right, and the center armrest adjusts up and down to help dial in a good cruising position. The steering wheel is tilt-only, but I didn't find this car particularly hurting for a telescope adjustment. It houses basic radio controls and cruise control buttons. Space in the front cabin is ample but not excessive, and all controls fall to hand easily and are clearly labeled. You never find yourself reaching or searching for anything in here. Cup holders are adequate with an okay pair in the center console and a cheesy third one popping out in front of one of the passenger's air vents. The i30 traded the Maxima's handbrake for a foot-operated, handle-released parking brake, which was intended to free up center console space and, I suppose, make American sedan shoppers feel more at home. In back, the spacious adult-friendly rear seat folds flat easily with a 60-40 split, and the trunk is long and easy to load. In a pattern that mirrored what Nissan had historically done with US market Maximas, there were essentially 2 basic flavors of i30. A base model car like this one was more comfort-oriented, while the i30T version, where the T stood for touring, was sportier. The i30T cost roughly $2,000 more and shed none of the base model's comfort and convenience features while adding performance equipment. The i30T came with a stiffer suspension for less body roll, 17-inch alloys with an extra half-inch of width for more grip, a viscous limited slip differential for better traction and power delivery, and xenon HID headlights with smoked lenses for visual distinction. Beyond your choice of i30 or i30T, there weren't much in the way of standalone options. Instead, a couple of options packages were offered, neither of which were selected for this particular specimen. One of those packages was the heated front seats and mirrors, which, oddly enough, also threw in a low windshield washer fluid light. The second main option package added a 6 CD changer along with a navigation system whose screen rose up out of the dashboard center stack in a futuristic fashion that would probably look goofy and outdated now. Finally, traction control was an option, and that's a bit of a jip considering that it was standard on many competitors by this point, and you can be assured that this particular car doesn't have it because, in fact, you had to spring for that heated seats package to even be eligible to buy traction control for $300. Indeed, Infiniti was perfectly happy to hold options hostage for one another with this car. I suppose their reasoning was that if you lived in Georgia like my grandmother and didn't see a need for heated seats, then you weren't likely to see snow and need traction control either. For Canadian buyers, however, a bit of relief was in order. Traction control and the limited slip differential from the i30T were standard equipment on all 2001 i30s sold in the Great White North. Standard equipment was mostly predictable, and we've mentioned a lot of it already, but for good measure, some of the bigger hits were the leather seats, 16-inch alloys, power sunroof, keyless entry, and the 200-watt Bose AM/FM CD cassette stereo. However, there was one conspicuously, bizarrely upmarket piece of equipment that came standard on all 2000 and 2001 i30s. It's this power rear sunshade. Not only was this not standard on cars like the Acura TL, it wasn't even an available option. You really only expect to see one of these on extra-large, ultra-luxury executive flagship sedans like, say, a BMW 7 Series. And although this neat feature is perfectly welcome and can help keep the cabin cool and comfortable, it does seem like a rather forthright attempt by Infiniti to say, this isn't a Maxima, this is a luxury car. But the deeper you dig under the skin of the i30, the more similar to the Maxima it's revealed to be. And that's not exactly a bad thing, because the 5th generation Maxima was a reliable, mechanically sound car that drove well. Take the i30's engine, for instance. This V6 is a member of Nissan's now legendary VQ engine family in its US debut 3.0-liter displacement. Shared with a Nissan or not, this VQ30DE was a world-class engine perfectly suited to a luxury car. In fact, it made Ward's 10 Best Engine list every single year it was sold in the US from 1995 to 2001. In a testament to this engine family's staying power, even as recently as 2016, a newer 3.5-liter version of the VQ was on Ward's list. This durable, all-aluminum, timing chain-driven engine sports dual overhead cams and 4 valves per cylinder. Instead of variable valve timing, however, which didn't arrive until the 2002 VQ35, Nissan employed a couple of other tricks to help level out the i30's power band. For 2000 and 2001, the VQ30 got a dual runner intake manifold and a variable capacity muffler. This engine is secured to the chassis with 4 mounts, 2 of which are advanced ferrofluid-filled electronically controlled units. Compression ratio is 10:1 and premium gas is recommended. It all adds up to an engine that punched above its 3.0-liter weight back in its day, with 227 horsepower and 217 pound-feet of torque, spread across a fairly broad torque curve. By the way, that's an extra 5 horsepower over the identical engine in the Maxima. How's that? Well, the Infiniti came with an extra air intake in one of the front fender wells. A Maxima will still win a drag race by a hair though, because at 3,342 pounds, the Infiniti is a little heavier, due somewhat to the extra features but also the additional sound deadening material. This generation i30 dropped the earlier model's rarely chosen manual transmission, so this 4-speed automatic was the only option. A 4-speed may seem like a relic now, but in 2001, it was right up there with smoking in the control room of a nuclear power plant, on the hairy edge of being acceptable. The Acura TL got a 5-speed in 2000 and the Lexus ES in 2001. An extra gear certainly wouldn't hurt the i30's driving performance or gas mileage, but this is a good sturdy unit overall. Steering is rack and pinion with speed-sensitive power assist. Front suspension is the quite conventional McPherson strut, and thick sway bars are present both front and rear. The rear suspension consists of a pair of coilover struts and trailing arms, locating a humble twist beam axle. Now, a rear beam suspension is fairly common on cheaper cars, but frankly, in 2001, this setup wasn't just beneath the class the i30 was in, it was beneath the class the cheaper Maxima was in. While this was a fairly sophisticated beam axle and Nissan was pretty proud of it, it's still a far cry from an independent rear suspension, which virtually all of the competition had, and this is absolutely one of the most glaring mechanical shortcomings of the i30. It's actually a fossilized reminder of Nissan's 1990s financial trouble. The 4th and 5th generation Maximas, the 2 generations that spawned corresponding Infiniti I's, actually took a step backwards from the 3rd generation Maxima's more advanced IRS in order to save money. While again, an independent rear suspension setup is unequivocally better overall than a beam, Nissan admittedly did put some serious engineering effort into this one, and it has to be one of the most advanced rear beam axle setups ever offered in a front-wheel drive car. Let me explain. A rear beam axle is typically accompanied by either a panhard rod or a Watts linkage to contain side-to-side motion. But a panhard rod is an overly simplistic solution that causes collateral body motions that are downright uncivilized, and a Watts linkage takes up a lot of space, which would encroach on the i30's trunk volume. Instead of either of these solutions, the Infiniti employs a so-called Scott-Russell approximate straight line mechanism, or Scott-Russell linkage for short. This clever, compact design allows for clean travel of the beam up and down while being laterally constrained. The final cherry on top of this setup, which was marketed under the Nissan trademarked name of Multi-Link Beam, was a very special bushing patented by Nissan, which was extremely soft when pushed in one direction, but firm when pushed the other way. While I'm amazed by the work of Nissan's engineers who, up against the firm requirement to use a rear beam suspension, displayed remarkable resolve and ingenuity, allow me to reiterate for the third time, this is not as good as an independent rear suspension. Cheesy rear suspension geometry aside, however, the i30 drives quite well thanks to an outstanding powertrain and good chassis tuning. The ride is well controlled without being stiff. Over cracked asphalt, the car maintains good composure, but more road feel and noise are transmitted into the cabin than you would find in the Lexus ES300, which was of course the supremely isolated car of the class. The highway ride is very good, benefiting from the car's strong overall stability, and in this venue, the limitations of the rear beam axle aren't readily apparent. Over rough pavement going any direction other than straight forward, however, the rear beam suspension shows its shortcomings. As the rear tires pass over hard bumps and corners, the rear of the car steps sideways with a distinctly cheap-feeling jolt. I found handling to be quite good, even sporty. Body roll is minimal, tire grip is good, and steering is confident, so the car holds the road surprisingly well in and out of corners on decent pavement. Unlike a lot of bigger V6 front-wheel drive cars, particularly of this period, the i30's nose doesn't feel excessively big or heavy, and front-end plow is minimal. The body remains quite flat as weight shifts side to side, and likewise front to rear, as in heavy acceleration or braking, reinforcing a feeling of overall composure and tightness. The four-wheel disc brakes are quite strong when called upon with good pedal feel. Steering is tight, with a medium level of assist and a moderate amount of road feel. Acute bouts of torque steer don't really seem to crop up, but it certainly doesn't have the unfiltered crispness of a rear-wheel drive car. Without ever having driven an i30T with its stiffer sport suspension, I feel like this base model already does pretty well, given this front-wheel drive chassis' inherent limitations, and any effort to further improve road holding would likely yield only marginal benefit while eroding ride quality appreciably. Also, for one reason or another, the i30T added 80 pounds weight and tacked 5 feet onto the already lackluster turning circle. Acceleration from this gem of an engine is strong and pleasing, if not neck-breaking. The old VQ30 is very smooth and refined by any standard, bested perhaps by Lexus, but few others in this regard. It plays well all over the rev band and torque is always abundant. Peak torque is up at 4,000 RPM, but roughly 7/8 of peak is available starting down at about 2,000 up through 6,000 RPM, with a smooth, linear progression up and down the band. Since the car isn't particularly heavy and the power is available relatively early, you may find that ordinary driving conditions rarely necessitate raising the tach needle very high. But in the event that you do need to speed up quickly, say in merging or passing operations, this engine will play along promptly and eagerly. Exhaust sound is muted, but the tone is relatively aggressive in my opinion, as is usual with this engine family. Good visibility and ergonomics round out a pleasant, polished driving experience in this now nearly 20-year-old car. Indeed, the i30 is at an age where much of its cohort feels plainly outdated to drive. But this doesn't feel like an old car. After all, certain things never really go out of style. Good driving manners, classic looks, not to mention durability, practicality, and refinement, have allowed this car to stand the test of time. But for as fundamentally good as the i-Series may have been, it represented a rehash of technology and concepts that, however sound, were readily available in many other closer-at-hand forms. This car struggled to find enough oxygen to survive in the marketplace, and it was ultimately canceled after the 2004 model year. Hoping to move onward and upward from the lean years of the 1990s, Infiniti replaced the i-Series with the rear-wheel drive, non-USDM Nissan-based M-Series. Standing before us today is an unsung hero, a well-rounded but unexciting car that was relegated to the dustbin of history and ultimately forgotten about. But a good number of i30s and i35s still endure and serve their owners well. As for this one, I hope it's got another few good decades left. After all, my grandmother, the highly satisfied original owner, says she's taking it with her when she goes.